to see you all, except I think I've got the wrong view, so I can't see all of you at all. I hope you can see me. I just wanted to say a few words really about the overall theme of place and community. It's clearly a very wide theme, which is why we've tried to focus it down today on engagement. But I guess you could break that down into three things really. Evidence and what it tells us. And then we've looked a lot about the impact on specific groups, on individuals and communities and places. And clearly, as Jonathan said, and we all know, the differential impact on all those. And then the third element in the theme is really the most difficult one, obviously, for all of us, is how do we progress? How do we learn and implement stuff from that learning? How do we move forward? Just saying a little bit about the evidence. Like the science, it's sometimes disputed. It's sometimes hard to interpret. It's very fast moving. And I think Jane may be saying a little bit about it's not self-evident always. Evidence in terms of its quality, where it's come from, what context it's coming from. However disputed, and sometimes this is, there are certain realities that we all know have been magnified, thrown up and exposed by COVID. And some of them are really not very comfortable, I think, for many of us to confront. So we have looked particularly at the impact, for example, on BAME communities, and Jane's going to say a little bit about that, but also clearly on disadvantaged places, on people who are already at a, poor or whatever, discriminated against. None of that surprising. I mean, we all would know that was going to be the case. I think what was quite surprising quite quickly was the extent of the differential impacts on different people. But mostly it wasn't surprising. We also know that each place is different, that within places even, there are differences in terms of that impact, and that there are very different and very complex factors that are interrelating. So how do we interpret those? How do we make sense of those? And how do we try to make sense of them in terms of how we project forwards? We also know, and I think this is going back to the differential impact, that where we had a situation that was already difficult and bad, that those situations have worsened and that they will get worse. We've looked particularly at health inequalities, where there is probably almost an immediate impact, but certainly down the line, there are going to be greater impacts. So today, I suppose, just to say in terms of the main questions, and Jonathan's talked a little bit about that anyway, you've had I think we gave you, or there was a question around how do we ensure genuine engagement in terms of recovery plans. And it's so easy to say, how do we do that? How do we consult? How do we get people to participate? And we all know, and I know from personal experience, how incredibly difficult it is. It's so easy to say and very, very hard to deliver. And it's not going to get any easier because of some of the issues that have arisen over the last few months. I think the two other, and obviously related, is what is the role of councils in all this? Are councils meant to be conveners? Are they bringing people together? Is that their main role? Are they promoters? Are they visionaries? Are they decision makers? Clearly councils are decision makers, or we wouldn't have them. And also, I think within that particularly, which we haven't, I think, drawn out so much in the content, and if you've looked at our new page, there's a lot of content there, but the role of counsellors, and it seems to me for this particular issue around engagement and participation, the role of counsellors is absolutely critical. And again, I say that from some personal experience. So there's a lot to discuss. We don't have that much time, so I'll shut up. But this isn't the end of this conversation. Post-COVID councils will go on. We're still getting contributions in for place and community. And really, we want to hear more of what you've got to say so we can add to what we've already got. So I'll finish there.
Thank you, Janet. And yes, I should have made those points that this is, we're publishing the first tranche of material on place and community today. We have published it today. It's live on our website, so do go and look at it. And this is very much the start of a conversation rather than a whole conversation. The purpose of this is to pick your brains, find out what you think are the most important issues and what we should be focusing on going forward. It's Jane.
Yeah, I mean, I think Janet's covered very succinctly the main points of what we're discussing. I just wanted to maybe add, maybe urge people to read a contribution that we've published today from a group called an organisation called Black Thrive, which talks particularly about the challenges of collecting and responding to knowledge and information from the perspective of a community and not falling back, as I think can happen, on sort of assumptions and sort of and perceived stereotypes when looking at data and when using that to kind of build or develop services. And the other caveat I would add that is that, not all communities, that should go out saying, are the same. So when you engagement with one, say, minority community, I think can sometimes stand in for engagement across a lot of communities, and that can't happen. Obviously, engagement with a Black British community is not the same thing and does not yield the same information as engagement with an Asian community or a community of Syrian refugees. So read the Black Thrive article, it's very good. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. It is a great piece. So yeah, do read that, but read all the other stuff too. Read all of it. All of it is great. Look, we've got a couple of speakers to sort of kickstart the conversation. First up is Dr. Tom Lloyd-Goodwin, who's Associate Director at Clares. Clares will be familiar to many of you. It's one of the leading organisations thinking about local economies, how we reframe local economies, how we make places work. Done a lot of work on, very famous for its work on community wealth building, amongst other things. Tom's been there since 2018 and is an expert on local economies, policy and research implementation, was the difficult but important bit of research. Tom, over to you.
Excellent, thanks Jonathan, and thanks for inviting me here today. So I'll just kind of talk for 10 minutes really about how in all of this we need to focus our attention on enabling the power of the community within the commercial economy and about how we can use community wealth building to achieve this aim. So I hope that's all right. So I think the first thing to say is, look, economic recovery from COVID-19, we know it's going to be a long and painful process. It's likely to be a process that's characterized by business failure, by huge levels of unemployment, and by social hardship on top of that as well. As a result, I suppose, of the public health crisis, we've seen an amazing response from communities with energy and imagination that comes from solidarity, empathy, and a genuine belief in the power of working together. But this is power that needs to be harnessed in the right way, however. I think, with the main economic crisis unfolding at pace, we've now got private equity firms waiting in the wings to snap up distressed business assets and take an even greater ownership stake in our economy. Consequently, it's going to take action on an unprecedented scale in modern times to safeguard the well-being of millions and drive transformation that's required to build back better. So the stakes here really are very high, and to prevent us from falling into what we might term as an Amazon recovery, where big business and corporate behemoths are the only winners, there are a number of national and local initiatives that we need to focus on. I'm not going to talk about the national here because I want to focus on the local, but very quickly in terms of the national, we're talking about things like buyouts, not bailouts, where government takes an equity stake in large firms that are in trouble. We need a new green industrial strategy that's focused on rapid decarbonisation, as well as increased activity in the everyday economy, as opposed to kind of the frontier sectors, which of course are very popular in all things industrial strategy. And we need a new social contract and welfare system that provides proper funding for public services. But as I say, I want to focus for the remainder of the talk really on the local. And, it's this idea then of animating power within the community and using that to kind of take the commercial economy head on, where we need to be focusing our attentions, and kind of I'll say a few words now about how we might go about this. So what we're seeing in our work at Clares across the UK is a growing movement then of local leaders who are committed to this idea of leaving behind the failed model of trickle-down economics, and their focus instead is on progressive reform through this idea that we call community wealth building. So community wealth building emerged in the 2010s. It's essentially a model of local economic development which tackles head-on the challenge of building a long-lasting and resilient economy. So it puts people and communities above this endless quest that we have for economic growth, which typically results in wealth and resource being extracted out of local areas and ending up in the pockets of distant shareholders. Ultimately then, community wealth building is aiming to replace large businesses which focus on maximising profits to shareholders with forms of business which produce more wealth for local people. So these generative businesses are firms in which surplus and profit that's created is retained by owners and workers. So these are businesses that include SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises, cooperatives, social enterprise, and other forms of community business. So building on this idea of community wealth building, and in response to COVID-19, we've published this document called Own the Future, which is a guide for new local economies, which sets out how this approach can and must really be mobilised to build genuinely inclusive economies in the wake of the pandemic. It's the kind of approach that we're now starting to see to be adopted in places like Wigan, Lewis and the Wirral. In Wigan, for example, where Clares has been working with the council over the last year to harness community wealth building principles to address economic inequalities. What we're seeing here is that in light of COVID-19, the council has really recognised that a need to create a fairer and more equal economy is even more acute in light of this crisis. And so we're now working with the council to make community wealth building a key part of the council's recovery plans. So essentially their approach, or the approach that they're taking in Wigan, builds on the underlying conviction of what many of you will know as the Wigan Deal, this idea that power should be shared with citizens and solutions co-designed as a result of that. Now, this goes beyond this idea of community power being a key tenet of public service reform. It's bigger than this really. It's really about partnering with the community to build community ownership within the commercial economy to counteract wealth extraction. So in this, we're starting to see a reimagining of how local economies can work, and it's underpinned by a commitment to return economic power to local people. So going forward, Wigan Council is committed to working in partnership with its other anchor institutions across the borough to embed community wealth building principles into procurement policies, recruitment processes, asset management, all with the idea of kind of involving the community more within the commercial economy. Now, in terms of kind of some more specifics about how councils can start to encourage more commercial enterprise from within their communities, as opposed to relying on large extractive and multinational companies, in the Own the Future document, we're advocating for the repurposing of existing business growth hubs, business support services, to become new community wealth hubs that would essentially provide an ecosystem of financial, technical and social support. So here, community energy would be, I suppose, channeled into the growth of employee ownership, of new community-owned businesses, to deliver goods and services that were previously delivered by extractive players in the private sector. So in addition to these hubs, what we're also going to need going forward is the transfer of some land and property that's been earmarked for traditional development, and that moved to the community to support local social enterprise. We need to look at unleashing mutual credit networks for business and look to grow community banks to help to provide local finance, as they're doing in the southwest, and they're also looking at in Lancashire at the moment as well. And we really need to kind of make best use that we can of new COVID-19 procurement rules to support more local cooperatives, social enterprises and community businesses through anchor supply chains. So the next part of this really is that, you know, in order to kind of build back better, there's also a vital role here for effective community engagement strategies to ensure that diversity and inclusivity are a big part of rebuilding local economies. And this is something that, you know, is a challenge for all local authorities. On this, CLES is doing some work at the moment with a number of authorities to deliver recommendations about how we can start to utilise such strategies. An emerging theme, which has kind of been touched upon, is the crucial role that counsellors play in all this, particularly in rebuilding trust, strengthening relationships with marginalised groups, and creating more direct lines of power kind of to the people in community. So here then, I suppose, you know, counsellors need to look at supporting their councils to make the most of these connections. We're kind of, you know, from some recent work that we've done in Hounslow, we're finding that this idea of the 21st century counsellor is particularly useful here, which kind of lays out the skills and attributes that councillors need to kind of operate in this modern context. Other conversations I've had really underlie the importance of the voluntary community social enterprise networks. I've had a number of conversations where we've talked about the importance of CVSs in all of this. It's not right for every area, but my experience of CVSs is that they play generally a vital role in being that bridging link, particularly in terms of signposting to harder reach groups without in the community. There's also, in the work that we've been doing, we've uncovered the important contribution that the wider group of anchor institutions can make in a local area. In Birmingham, for example, Aston Business School has received some funding from the European Regional Development Fund to support diverse and minority-owned businesses to enter the supply chains of major contractors and organisations with a view to building a more inclusive local economy. So what this project's doing, it's drawing on the expertise from people within the business school to provide advice to small firms as to how they can get involved and provide goods and services within these bigger organisations. Just in terms of a final point then before I finish, I think, you know, the resurgence of community action, community power, particularly in light of COVID-19, is powerful, and it really needs to kind of be the reanimation and the restarting of something. At CLES, we've spoken a lot recently about the fact that the community and the local state need to be on a joint mission to build a better economy. They should really be partners and allies against the threat of state centralism and underfunded local services. But, you know, in this, let's be crystal clear here. The community is not, and it never should be, a replacement for the local or national state. With our public services stretched to breaking point and with huge impending economic and social crises, this idea from some quarters that hard-pressed communities can or should provide a substitute for the state, we think needs to be continuously challenged. You know, we must be wary of any kind of slippery slope in which a struggling community sector ends up delivering less with less and inadvertently contributes to the weakening and hollowing out of the public sector. Local government should really be a bureaucratic manifestation of the community and the human bonds between us all. No one wants a rerun of the big society. So if ever there was a time to harness the power and energy in our communities to repurpose our economy, that time really is now. Communities must be empowered to take the economy on as we rescue, recover and reform in the wake of COVID-19. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tom. That was excellent. Loads in there. I think, you know, that focus on aligning sort of economic and social value feels really crucial. I really like the emphasis on you know, a very practical emphasis on what do councils need to do and be in order to do that, and how do they work in partnership with all those different parts of the public realm. I guess some questions from me, but which hopefully we'll come back to, around, you know, how do we keep that window open? It feels like we've sort of got a moment where that conversation is happening. You've been having that conversation with lots of councils. We hear lots of people saying that. It also feels like there are all sorts of other pressures piling up. You know, there's a sort of there is a sort of centralisation coming in from the state. I think there is pressure to just kind of go back to January 2020, and I think I'll be interested to hear from you later about how we kind of keep that energy in there. But before we go back to that, let's hear from, and what I'm going to do, everyone, I can see hands coming up. I'm going to hear from both our speakers, and then I'm going to open it up. So, Pippa, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks, Tom. I'm from Carnegie UK Trust. We work across the UK and Ireland to promote well-being. And I just want to make that point because our idea of well-being is around societal well-being, which we see as really being the purpose of government. And community well-being, so that's living well together, and individual well-being, which of course there is much talk about and should be much talk about at the moment in terms of our mental health and well-being. And I think one of the key aspects that Janet referred to at the start, this idea of how inequalities have been magnified during the pandemic, that's something we're particularly focused on when we're thinking about well-being economies. So well-being economies, as Tom well knows, very closely allied to community wealth building. What we've seen, I think, during the pandemic and during the discussions around how the pandemic's affected people unequally, is that our lives are holistic, that they're not divided into health and economy. That's not how we live as people. It's not how we live as society. And so this pressure that we have not really ever succeeded in fulfilling, this idea of joint working, I think it's more important than ever. We've got to really understand that we don't live single issue lives, and we've got to be able to see that out in our local authorities, in our local government, in our central government, and in our communities. So what's one of the ways in which we can do that? Well, at the Trust, we've been thinking a lot about what is the role of local government and what is the role of government versus communities. Of course, I completely agree with Tom. The last thing we want is to go back to big society here. It's very much about thinking about what are our own assets, whether that's as a local government organisation, whether that's a community organisation, whether that's an individual, and how we can strengthen and use those assets to our best ability. So we're thinking about local government as enabling communities, not about communities replacing any organisations, nor about being replaced, but how we enable the communities to shine, as in many places they have done during the pandemic. So through the Enabling State programme, we've had a whole series of research and advocacy for over 6 years. And we have this, we've just recently released as an update to our pathway to the Enabling State. And I'll just share my screen with you to show you that, hopefully. So here's what we see as the steps to helping achieve recovery through Enabling State. The first one is the one I'd already touched on, putting well-being at the centre. So it's having a well-being focused government, a well-being focused local government, a well-being focused economy. And the second one is this idea of giving permission to take control. That's something that we have seen examples of. I'm sure you have examples in all your local authorities of where, because of the sense of urgency and because of the sense of the shared struggle, I suppose you might say, during the pandemic, that some red tape has been relaxed. People have been able to have small amounts of money without necessarily having strings attached in order to provide what was needed for their communities. So in some cases, communities and individuals didn't need food as such, or their needs went beyond basic needs. There's a lot of respect, I think, has been a lot of respect for supporting people in a dignified way and meeting people where they're at. So there's small amounts of money that were given out to provide books, to help provide gardening tools, if you're lucky enough to have a garden. All these sorts of things have been really important, money that has come without the necessary strings, for example. And the sharing of data between agencies has been really important in order to avoid duplication and to meet needs. So the second one we have here, the third one we have here, is around helping people to help each other. We'll also, obviously, we've had all these examples of that through mutual aid, but I think there's something bigger and stronger than that around the idea of community power, as Tom was talking about. How can we really encourage communities to be able to step up? And maybe that's where, you know, you've mentioned the role of counsellors really come in. counsellors as empathetic leaders, as leading by example. I know stories we've heard, particularly from the CVS, I suppose, and from the third sector, where there's been very effective partnership working between the third sector and councils, is where a counsellor, for example, once worked in their local CVS, and therefore there was a very good personal relationship, with a really good understanding of different sectors. And supporting people to participate fully is another of our key mantra, I suppose you might say. The other day we were speaking with Lancaster City Council, and they've adopted 2 years ago, in fact, the disability rights slogan, "Nothing about us without us," and they say nothing about us without us is for us. And they've used their work through the COVID pandemic to put together community conversations, and they've gone out from their hubs that they've developed during the pandemic to speak to communities, to ask them, what matters to you? So I think it is very important that we build on this work, the relationships have been developed during the pandemic, to ask people what matters to them. It's very important that we move upstream. In Scotland, 10 years ago, we had the Christie Commission for Developing Public Services, and that was very strong on the need for more investment in preventative services. It's been very difficult to achieve. We're going to be reviewing it, I'm sure, in the year ahead, and I'm sure we'll be reviewing it in the light of COVID and the inequalities that COVID has brought to fore. So it's not just about working with people when they're young or working with young people. It's about ensuring that our health services, for example, are focused on public health, not just curative and acute health. And then the principle around building in radical kindness, you may have heard of some of the work that Carnegie and others has done around radical kindness. This again, I think, has been, a light has been shone on this during the pandemic. People have experienced and talked about many acts of kindness, but we're going beyond here, the idea of just random kindness, but the idea of having a relational type of engagement between public services and between individuals, the idea of radical kindness, where people who are working in public sector, public services, are kind of allowed to do what they want to do, what they probably say they joined to do if they're a nurse or a frontline worker, for example, allowed to care. And then we have this idea of building an authentic story of change. I think this very closely relates to the idea of putting well-being at the centre. It's very place-focused. How can we support places to understand, well, not to understand, to articulate, to come together around a vision for what they want to be in the future, a vision which may be built on their past and may recognise the past, but also is really strongly focused on their assets and where they want to be in the future. So just to say in summary, I think that we have so many opportunities going forwards, as Tom and others have highlighted, but we are at a bit of a hiatus point here, we're at a bit of a crux. And I think it's really important that we take a hold of the good things that have occurred, particularly in partnership building between communities and local government, and we develop those good things going forward, rather than reverting to a scenario where we were in before, which seemed to be this rather endless treadmill of repeating the same and the same. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Pippa. And look, I was so excited to hear from Pippa that I forgot to introduce her properly. But luckily she did it herself. Pippa Coots, who's Policy and Development Manager at Carnegie UK Trust. Again, loads to pick up on there, particularly around this kind of this hinging moment. How do we make sure we continue, we get momentum to move forward rather than just reverting back to where we started. Let's open it up. Who would like to come in with